I have a story to tell, and that story is a very human story, but it is also anything but. That story begins when my life does. At least the part of my life that I can remember, when I was about 3 years old. At that time, my parents had divorced, and I was living with my dad. There were events leading up to this that I was told of that existed in an apocryphal state in my mind, but of which I can see evidence, sometimes even on my own body, such as when my mom, not putting shoes on my brother or myself when she was taking care of us before she brought us back to live with our dad, had taken us to a McDonald's where a metal door into the establishment being opened, sliced off my toenail and dug deeply into my toe. It probably wasn't too far from being torn off. And so I have always had this scar, and I've always had this story, but I've never had the memory of what happened. And all of that is to say that the relationship between my parents was embedded similarly in me, in the sense that I feel like I carried it as a wound that felt like a part of me. Because with my toenail, I never really rejected the scar that I had, even though it was hideous and created a ridge in my toenail that ran into a deep, hot white in my toe itself. But I always felt like it had something about it that felt like me. It didn't feel like it didn't belong. And similarly, when I was in preschool, I remember having a side to me that was somewhat cruel. There was a child I remember seeing stand on top of a block, and he was wearing sweatpants. I was 3 or 4 at the time, and he was just too perfectly positioned, and I knew I had to pull his pants down. There was no logic or rationale behind it, and I don't think I had the capacity to really feel bad about it because of the perfection of the moment and the way it was arranged. Now, the reason that I talk about this is because what I'm going to describe is a psyche that was specifically arranged to have particular dispositions and particular capacities that would allow me to become a specific person with a lot of polarity in my personality, with a lot of duality. But duality that generally didn't emerge to the surface, because as I became an adult, those kinds of instincts and impulses became stories in my mind. They became no more than passing thoughts, as any thoughts that would emerge from a movie or the reading of a book. And this storied aspect of my mind also had a quality when I was little, because my dad, once I started to live with him, had 2 movies that he watched more than any others. Now, I watched Disney movies. I watched The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. I remember seeing those many times as a child. But I also watched these very adult movies that my dad enjoyed, specifically Aliens and The Terminator. Now, the reason I mention these stories, these movies, in the context of this telling is that they were part of that psychology that developed in me. And now I'm not talking about behavior. What I'm talking about is a realism. Because when I watched The Terminator at 4 years old, when I saw Arnold Schwarzenegger removing his eye at the restaurant bathroom, when I saw the main character Kyle Reese die, I had to fight with my mind to try and make it seem like it wasn't real. And I couldn't. To me, it just seemed real when I saw blood on the floor, and I told myself it's just ketchup. I just knew I was just telling myself that because to me, to my heart, to my mind, everything about what I was seeing was reaching me emotionally as an experience, as if I were there, as if I were watching it. And it was the same with Aliens, which was like seeing a documentary made in hell. It was so real and so horrific, so oppressive, so dark. And for me, the silver lining there, though, is that in the end, the heroes do triumph. Ripley does escape. She escapes the aliens and she takes the child Newt with her. And so because there was a child in that movie too, it had a strong connection to me as well. It grounded me in that world. And I kept watching movies like these throughout the duration of my childhood and my youth. And they kept having an effect on me. And what that effect was, you could call it trauma. You could say that I had PTSD from seeing these films at too early an age. What I would call it is a felt familiarity with the aspects of human life, with the archetypes of the world. In the same way as when I watched Schindler's List and I saw the way that people experienced deprivation and loss and the suffering of lack and just not having, starvation, a slow death, these things that seem almost like, almost boring when you compare it to the ways that you can die if your imagination really gets let loose. But there was something about that boredom that was mixed with that death that was so much darker and so much worse. It felt like it was emblematic of the worst parts of the human spirit. And so all of that was somewhere in me, but it wasn't what I would call my own personal trauma, even though those things would lead to, I think, certain disconnections that occurred internally. And so that was sort of like the garden of my life. That was the fecund material into which my thoughts were planted so that it would arise as who I knew myself to be, and where my feelings were connected to something and from which they arose in a way for me to interact with them, which was often as a feeling that nothing really mattered. And it was sort of a permission to myself to occasionally do something that I didn't really believe in, because things could be so dark, because things could fall apart so completely. So what did it matter in the end? But before I get to that, I need to go back to the beginning of my story, back to when I was 4, because there was, I guess, what I experienced as a force that came into my life. And that force was the human aspect of that same energy, that same emptiness, crossed with that same despairing kind of that same despairing kind of quality. At least how I experienced it was despair, but I experienced it as an external emptiness that came into my life and had no care for the effect that it had. And that emptiness was a woman. Now, my first memory of this woman is when I was 4 years old or so, and she was taking care of me, and I wanted to read a story. And she yelled at me, "Shut up," and walked away because I was not able to say which story I wanted to read. I was having trouble deciding. And so she went back to doing laundry. And this woman became my stepmother. And this moment was emblematic of our entire relationship. Of me having breakfast in the morning that she'd cooked when I was 7 and saying, "These eggs are hard." And her throwing the food in the dog's food bowl saying, "Well, the dog will enjoy it then." Now I say the dog as a reflection of, the archetype connected to that moment. That quality of, well, if you don't want this, then I'll give it to somebody who is, going to appreciate it. And don't forget that someone is a dog. And so it says something about me. Now, my stepmom loved our family dog, probably more than she loved me, certainly. And I think that was the reminder there. But the dog wasn't, made food in the morning. She didn't make him eggs. He got my eggs. He got my food. When I had rejected her, then it showed in her mind a rejection. I was just a child saying, "These eggs are hard." Like, I don't know. My grandma didn't make hard eggs. But it it pitted him against me. It put us on this scale of valuation between me and the dog's name was Timber, between me and Timber. And so there were moments like that, or like the time that she came up in the morning and I was eating frosted mini wheats, and she said, "You should eat a healthier cereal, one without sugar, one that isn't covered in sugar." And I said, "Well, what do you suggest?" And she said, "What about Raisin Bran?" And I said, again, being a child and defaulting to reason to manage this situation, the raisins on Raisin Bran are covered in sugar. And what she did was she said, "No, they are not." And this went back and forth. And I said, "Why don't you just open the cupboard by your head and look at the cereal? It's right there, you can see it." And around this time, my dad came in and he said, "Don't talk back to your mother." So it was an early event that demonstrated that people didn't really care so much about the truth or what was right in the sense of what was an accurate description of reality. They cared about what they viewed as respect, which is really just a defaulting to their version of authority as a kind of emblem of correctness that needed to be socially acknowledged by me just saying, yes, ma'am, you're correct. I'm not going to challenge you. I'm not going to say what I see as true. And the thing to me about this is that in my mind, I wasn't challenging her. I was listening to the statement and I was recognizing it as untrue. The statement that Raisin Bran was not covered in sugar, when in fact it was. I simply stated a fact that could be proven, that could be demonstrated, but which no one had any interest in demonstrating or proving. And then when I was in 7th grade, I asked for help with my homework one night. And my dad said, well, why don't you have your stepmom help you? She's real smart. So she came down to my room. She helped me listen to me for 5 minutes and then just said one thing, which was, "You're stupid." And then she left. And so I went back to being solely responsible for myself and my education, where I didn't receive help. And I was at quite a difficult school. And the school strained me in its own way because I had to work very hard. And I was always turning in everything last minute because that was my personality to do so. And I was always still behind, even though I knew I had the capacity to do very well. I was always behind and the other kids were ahead. And so one day when I was in high school, all of this came together, along with something that I haven't mentioned, which actually I need to talk about first, which was my parents' relationship at home. It was horrendous. When I was in 2nd grade, I used to count down the hours as the time they were about to get home approached, because I was a latchkey kid. I came home. I could just walk home from school. And I'd get home and I'd start watching like cartoons, Spider-Man and Batman and stuff like that. And then Home Improvement came on around 4:30. And I liked that show. It depicted a functional family, which, as I'll get to in a second, was not like mine. But as 4:30 hit, that's when I started to feel anxious. 5 o'clock came, and 5:30, and in this time period, there was a feeling I can only describe as cold. A cold anxiety fell over me. But to me, it was just cold, like a stillness in the air that could be pierced by any sound. It could be pierced by ice itself, the iciness of that feeling. And then my parents would come home, and I'd hear their feet on the floorboards above. And I didn't know whether they were about to start yelling at each other and stomping around and slamming cupboards, or if it was going to be a quote-unquote normal night. And that was the environment for a long time. Now, they were not physically abusive, and I didn't even think I was coming from an abusive household. But they were verbally abusive with each other, in the sense of not necessarily name calling, but creating a power dynamic that was so out of balance that it was highly toxic and highly damaging, that was founded in words like, "You're trying to take advantage of me. You're turning this into a power struggle." Things like that. Things that were so common to my household that if I used those terms with other kids, they were like, "What the hell are you talking about?" But to me, that was just everyday language for our household. And it was about power and about place. And so that was the dynamic. And so while my parents were not physically abusive, though, I did have an older brother. And he created the feeling of an unsafe space physically. There was an entire week after school in 2nd grade where he bit me every single day. And so I just had a big bite mark on my arm. In the summers, I'd go and stay with my grandparents. And my grandparents were really, wonderful family. They were very normal people in that regard. It was a normal, stable household with a degree of old ass grandpa saying misogynistic shit. He was a Republican, and he'd tell me every day, we'd go for walks, he'd say, "Andrew, never get married." It took me forever to realize he was talking about my grandmother, because I loved my grandmother. just never really occurred to me that he could mean that there was something wrong with marrying her. And he had somewhat complicated relationship with her, but by the end of his life, I think he really did appreciate her. And then by the very, very end of his life, he'd sort of fallen back into just being this very reclusive person. So that was his personality. He didn't necessarily really want people in his life. He didn't necessarily love the people in his life. He didn't want to leave them any of his money that he had when he died. And I don't think he saw the value in supporting the people in his life. My dad convinced him otherwise at the time, but that was just, how he felt. And so when I was with my grandparents, though, in the summer, it was a very free time, and it gave me space. Almost like the concept of dying and going to heaven and getting space from the earth. It gave me space to be with myself and to feel love and to have a normal environment that sat somewhere in my psyche and in my psychology. And there was a very pivotal and telling moment during this time when early on, when I would go to stay with my grandparents, as I went every year, I would cry because my dad wasn't there. And I loved my dad very much, which was why his relationship with my stepmother was so traumatizing to me. Because he would become just as toxic and negative as she was. And one example of that, I don't mean to stray away from the story I was about to tell, but it's important, is that when I was 8 or so, I came up the stairs in our house. We had a basement, and the stairs came up to the kitchen and also the back door. And there was a door closed at the top of the stairs, separating those stairs from the kitchen. And my dad and my stepmom were sitting at the table, and they were talking one night, and I came up the stairs and I sat and I listened in horror, because what my stepmom was saying was what a terrible child I was. And my dad was sitting there, and I remember the tone of his voice was he said, "Oh, I know." Like he's just the worst. As if he were saying that about me, that I were just the worst. And I think he was happy to have a connection between him and her, something they agreed on. Because as he told me about right after they got married, she sat on the floor, beating her head against the floor and saying, "I want to die." So they had some real discord. And my dad would take many opportunities where he and her agreed that my brother or I had done something wrong, and he would take many opportunities to yell at us with her, and this seemed to give him a sense of happiness, that finally he and she were agreeing on something, they were getting along. And so they would, as we described it in the family, team up on my brother and I. Team up and yell at us. And we weren't allowed to talk back, so I would avoid that. They were difficult enough as it was without any of that. So let me go back to where I was talking about my grandparents' house after establishing that aspect of my parents' relationship and the fact that I truly loved my dad, and we would, play video games together and spend some very nice moments together where he was very thoughtful. He was an engineer, and so was my stepmom. But my dad would tell me about systems in the world and computers and technology and these things he cared about. And so that was a very nice part of our relationship. And that just goes to show how far I had to fall in my feelings for what I'm about to describe to happen, which is that I was leaving my grandparents' house one summer in 7th grade, I think, and I just broke down crying and crying and crying. And my grandparents asked me, "Why are you crying, Andrew?" And I said, "I don't want to go home. My parents fight, and it's just a terrible environment." I didn't even think my dad really loved me at that point because of how miserable and stressful it was. And so my grandma said, "Well, we'll call your dad. You can stay here with us." And for me, that was a dream come true. I loved their house and I loved them. It was a place that brought me incredible peace. And it was a life that brought me incredible joy. My grandma would take me to karate lessons every day. And I mean every day. We had to drive 20 minutes into town, 25 minutes. And I wanted to go every day that they were open, Monday through Friday. And she would take me every day. And then we would go to church on Sundays. She was a Christian Scientist, and she loved God, and she loved Christian Science. And she loved Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of that church. And I loved her. And so it was something, it was like a dream come true. I thought it could never happen. I just thought that I couldn't stay with them. It was too good to be real. And she called my dad, and I was sure that he would say yes because they were asking. Because he didn't seem to have any real special affection for me anymore. But instead, he told them, "Send Andrew home." And so I went home, and I got home and came back into that same cold, empty, yawning chasm that existed in my heart there and in the family's heart as I experienced it. And so that brings me to a realization that I had when I was about 18. I was sweeping. I was in a theater because I'd gone to high school in Utah where I lived, and I had a job at a theater. And I was sweeping the refuse from the floor into a bin. And all of a sudden I realized I existed. Up to that moment, it had been like I was automated. I was just a set of processes running, sweeping dust into bins, welcoming customers to the theater, conversing with people that I ran into during the day. And all of a sudden, in that moment, what happened instead was I realized I existed. And it was the worst moment of my life. It was the most present I had been, because suddenly I saw my hands. I saw the motion of the broom. I saw the things that I had just been experiencing subconsciously up to that point. And this is part of something that I didn't have an awareness of, which is that I was experiencing, well, the best way to describe it is actually with another story. Because it's hard to describe how I handle psychological conditions because it's very different than the way that other people do. I had severe depression. I wasn't really aware of it, but I was aware of it to a degree. But what happened was I was at the park with a friend of mine one day, and I said, "Hey, you know that feeling where you're kind of floating around like here, or around here like this, you know? Like you're never really seeing out of your eyes?" And my friend turned to me, and I remember this so clearly because it seemed to me as if there were no way for anybody to experience the world any differently, as if that's just how everyone experienced life, because I couldn't experience it differently. And my friend says to me, "No, I don't." And I remember that moment because I thought to myself, how? How is that even possible? It was a complete mystery to me. because being in this state of disconnection with my physical body was just how I experienced the world. All I did was think all the time, in a certain sense. Because I wasn't, having thoughts about new things constantly, but I was experiencing sort of an emotional reality of self as kind of a field. And this is something I'd come to realize later, but it was as if all of the social constructs and archetypes, ways of talking, ways of interacting, ways of seeing the different layers and levels of society, different themes and topics, like the transport of guns and munitions, dealing with disease, dealing with poverty, dealing with the terrible situations on the planet, or interpersonal conflict, dealing with people's beliefs and those kinds of realities. It was all like this singularity of a perspective that was embedded in me, and it was almost like I existed around that, like it sat in front of me. And that's why it felt so automated. Everything just came out of me. I didn't really think when I spoke. I didn't really have to try. Things just came out. And I'd spend a lot of time, listening or quiet, which I think people appreciated, and it put them at ease. But there was a disconnection between who I was and my persona. And I didn't know who I was. To me, who I was just that floating thing, that perspective, that disconnection itself, almost. And by this time, I had lost a significant portion of my ability to smell. When I was a child, I remember the smells of pine. I remember the smells of grass and the freshness on the wind. I remember the smell of turpentine in my grandfather's workshop, where he fixed and sold guns from World War II. Mostly from World War II. And so he would go to gun shows and do that. And the smell of turpentine was always around in the house. I remember the smell of wet mud. My memory of these things is stronger than my ability to smell them now, or at that time. And when I was 18, my memory was so bad, I just thought I'd never been able to smell. It wasn't until years later, after going through a therapeutic process that I'll come to later in this video, that those smells started to come back. Because as you may be aware, smell and memory have a connection. And so, having talked all about that, there is one last thing to address about this part of my life, which is really two things, and that is video games. And it is something that has to do with the nature of me as being somewhat different from other people. So, from very, very young in my life, my dad, video games have always been a part of my life that I can remember because my dad was always playing video games. His favorite video game when I was really, really little was Betrayal at Krondor. And my stepmom really hated video games, and she would take every opportunity to tell me what a waste of time they were. Even going so far as to say that my favorite magazine, which was called Nintendo Power, was a magazine that was brainwashing me through advertisement. So you can see the negative relationship that she had to my joy. But video games were a sanctuary for me. They were always a refuge. And that refuge in my life came first, I would say, personally for me, in the series called The Legend of Zelda, which I used to watch my dad play on the Super Nintendo. And so it was a way of me carrying my pure relationship to him that was disconnected from this, frankly, absolute harpy, this shrill, cold, searingly bitter woman who was brought into our lives that my dad had some connection to. I never understood why they powered through it, It just seemed like such a miserable reality for both of them, like neither of them. I didn't know how he could be happy, and my stepmom very vociferously expressed her discontent with the situation, even going so far as to say one day on the way home, on the way to school, that her email address had the number 95 in it because that was the year, according to her, that her life ended. And that was also the year that she married my dad and came into our family, essentially. So, figure that one out. And it was that kind of emotional brutality that ran under the structure of my whole relationship to them. Because, with her, because she could be just so totally careless about feelings, so blasé toward this destructive effect that she had with these words that I was extremely sensitive to, because I had somewhat of an adult psychology even then, or I would perhaps say even a fully adult psychology. There's never been a time in my life when I didn't know what sex was, when I hadn't seen extreme violence, when I didn't, when I was like, again, 8 or 9, maybe 10, my parents rented a war documentary from Vietnam from the library, and I watched that, and it had footage of people being shot. It had terrible things displayed in it in a very real way. There's never been a time in my life when I wasn't dealing with adult themes, including between them in this inescapable way where my dad and my stepmom would both come and talk to me, and they would both say, although I remember this about my stepmom, at least for sure, she would say, "Your dad's been talking about me behind my back," as she talked to me about him behind his back, Like I said, behind his back. And my dad didn't have anybody else to talk to, really. He had my brother and I, and he had one friend that he sometimes spoke to, but I don't think he really confided in anybody. He would go to work, he'd be on Microsoft Excel, he'd come home, he made a game in Microsoft Excel. That's the kind of person my dad was. He made a hockey game. He almost certainly had autism. Certainly does. Like, absolutely. My dad is autistic. And so, like, that's what supported this relationship between him and my stepmother, and that's where, a lot of the emotional kind of abuse was given a ground to exist. It sort of sat on top of his principles, and one of those principles was, a successful marriage is a long marriage, and there was no real concept of happiness in that. And at the same time, my dad did support happiness and was, in his own way, a loving person. Like a very loving person and a very successful parent in that regard of sharing love with his kids. He could just also completely flip sides, to the absolute other end of the spectrum. And come from a place that had nothing to do with love, that was maybe more principled. I don't know what it was, to be honest. It was like he cared, but he didn't. And in that way, I think he reminds me of my mom, who told me when I got older, she said the reason that she left my brother and I and returned us to our dad was, one, we loved our dad, which is, sensible. We did. And 2, she said that when I was 3, she had given me a hug and left one morning, and I was crying and crying and crying. And then she went on a trip, and when she got back, I just didn't seem connected to her anymore. And so in her mind, that gave her permission to go. And this is where I was talking about my special psychology that I developed that came from all of these things. Because when I was a little kid, I saw my mom, when I was 7, 8, and 9, she came back to live in Utah where I lived, and she was around. She took me bungee jumping on my birthday. And she'd read tarot cards and do these sorts of things, which were, very different from the environment I had at home with these two engineers. And my mom, I just saw her as like an acquaintance. I didn't even really see her as my mom or even as a mom. Sometimes she felt like it. There were times when it was just her and me, and we would go to the park and or go to the aviary and see the birds. And at the park, there was this ride that spun around with these chairs that swung out. And I remember her looking at me in the ride, and the way that she looked felt to me like a mom, like a real mom. But when we were at her house, it was like she stopped really seeing me or paying attention. There were other things going on. She had to do things with her dog or on the phone. We'd get sent over to the neighbor's house, and they're watching some like really crazy movie, and my brother and I are just sitting there like kind of horrified. Or we'd go down to the Circle K and get food and try and play the arcade machine there. And so my mom didn't necessarily want my brother and I watching like bad movies. And so even though we did with my dad, what I'm really saying is that there was this sense of just like kind of an absent parent in that way. Even when I was with her, she was only partly present. And so back to what I was saying though, is that the reason I say that is to say that there was a love connection between both me and my dad and me and my mom. There was what I would call like a complete, like I could see a full parent in both of them. I could see what a real parent looked like. It's just, it was enshrouded in all of these other things, sort of where their hearts were going. My mom really wanted to be an actress and had all of these aspirations of doing that, and living some grand life. And so you could see that creating one reality for her. And my dad, I think he had such an investment in the dynamic between him and my stepmother that it would overshadow his relationship to my brother and I. And sometimes he couldn't see my brother at all. And my brother was pretty wild in a lot of ways, which was the exact opposite of what my dad liked. Now, my grandparents let me stay with them because I was so well behaved. Adults often felt like I was just the nicest child in the world, basically. And my brother, though, being not so well behaved, he also had dyslexia. And so my dad, I remember, would handle this, and his way of handling it was to get so frustrated that he's just sitting there shouting at the top of his lungs at my brother for not being able to read. And so while there was love in the family, it was punctuated by so many moments like this, and there was an underlying tension arising from so much of this that there was a feeling of not really mattering and of disconnection and of a lack of emotional safety. But the one area where that didn't exist, that was ever present in my life, was with video games. And so I could always turn to video games to encounter the full expression of my excitement, my joy in life, the thing I truly cared about. And that always stayed pure, because if I played games with my dad, it was always a pure thing. And now with my grandparents, my uncle lived with them, and so when I would visit them in the summer, I would see my uncle, and my uncle and I would play video games. And my uncle had this personality that was very relaxed, at least on the surface. I found out later he wasn't really quite so relaxed, but it was in his spirit too. And so that's, I guess, a theme in all of this, is that everybody I knew, except for my grandmother, had some aspect of their personality that was in conflict with what they presented in a way that nullified the positive part of my relationship and my experience of them. But at the time, before my uncle kind of went off the deep end, which I may talk about later, he was just, the best. He was the person I looked forward to seeing more than anybody in the world. He was this fun force that would like sweep into my life periodically when he would come out of the woodwork, basically, of his, like, he lived in a shack that was kind of attached to my grandparents' house. At first he lived in a bedroom in their house, but then they had a separated garage and renovated it for him, and he would live there. But I remember when I was a kid, all I wanted to do in the summers was play video games with him when I didn't have karate or these other things to do. And he just always had this great laugh and this wonderful sense of humor. He was always joking about the games and the characters and creating little stories that were really amusing. And he had these like fun, almost childlike expressions. Like if he lost in a game, he'd go "Wah!" and stamp his feet, but like very, in this very disarming way that you knew was just for fun and it was to make you laugh. And so he was real nice to me as a kid, and I'll always remember that about him and always be grateful for it. He really taught me a part of my own personality. And so while my dad was a bit more buttoned up, he was an engineer, he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he was against drugs, and he just worked and had this horribly toxic relationship. And he would also play like one game every day, whether that was the hockey game he made in Excel or it was Age of Empires or Rise of Nations. He spent thousands of hours in these games, and that was his comfortable, like, safe space. And my grandma was also, like, my grandma and my grandfather, all teetotalers. Nobody drank, nobody smoked. So there was that role model that was really present in our lives. My uncle, on the other hand, was not like that. My uncle would always go out for cigarettes, and he always had beer around somewhere, which this does lead into the problems that I came to see later with him later in life. But he was more relaxed, and he was the most fun person that I'd ever talked to, that I'd ever interacted with. And so as I became older, I didn't have any kind of, I think to be honest, I probably always would have been drawn toward substances to some degree, just as like a countercultural kind of expression, because I had such a resistance to society. But I think because of my extremely positive relationship to him, I didn't have a negative relationship to those things. Instead, I could drink or smoke, and it wasn't an act of rebellion. It was just, I was just being like my uncle. And he was a really nice person. And so I had, these things were incorporated into my life in a fun way. And I've been kind of talking around what I was going to say earlier, so I'll get back to that now, which is, again, video games and that safe space that they created, and that I spent so much of, my time in that safe space with my uncle, where we played a lot of games together. It was a really big part of my life. He had like a huge closet full of books. It was all these sci-fi books by like Robert Heinlein, and there were and he had all the Conan the Barbarian books, and there was like a Doom book in there. There were just countless books of fantasy and science fiction. And my grandfather was always reading too, and there was a theme in our family, which was like reading was always supported. You could always get a book. I couldn't necessarily ask my dad for a movie or for a game, except on special occasions like my birthday, but I could always get a book at Costco if I saw something I wanted. And my grandfather would always also support books like Harry Potter. I remember he took me to get all those when they came out. But my uncle had this closet full of comics and science fiction and high fantasy, and so that was just, that was his personality. And And it was, he played Dungeons and Dragons and would tell me stories about Dungeons and Dragons. And this was a long time ago, before these things were really, more popular. It was back when, even, when I was in high school, I'd get made fun of for playing video games and being a nerd and these sorts of things. And so, this was, a lot of my memories are from back in the late 90s, early 2000s that I'm talking about. And yeah, so when I played games with him, it was this just wonderful experience, just two guys, him and me, sitting on a couch. I'm not a guy, I'm a little guy. But it felt like two guys sitting on a couch and just talking about the things that were on our minds, And I didn't always have stuff to say, but I had a lot of fun, and I'd contribute from that feeling of fun, and he'd talk about, things that made me laugh, and I guess we'd just talk about the games a lot. But that feeling of just being on the couch with a friend and passing the controller back and forth, and both of us trying the same section and failing and giving the other person a try and going back and forth it was just this part of my life that was so important to me. It felt like everybody must have had that experience on some level. Like everybody had to know what that was. It had to be a common thing. And as my life went on, I found out it really wasn't. I didn't mean that everybody sat on a couch with their uncle and played video games, or sat on a couch with a friend, but I mean that I couldn't really find that experience again. I didn't really find anybody who wanted to do that with me, who wanted to just sit on a couch and have fun playing a game. And, my cousin and I had a cousin who, I once actually skipped a friend's wedding, just because I went to my cousin's house and we were playing Gears of War in cooperative mode, and I was having so much fun that I just was like, I don't want to go to the wedding. It wasn't that I didn't want to go to the wedding, I don't want to go to the wedding, I'm not going to go. If I didn't have anything else to do, I would have gone. I would have gone, basically, if not for Gears of War, is what I'm saying, because my cousin and I were having so much fun playing. And that's just how much those experiences meant to me. And I didn't know how hard that might be to find later, to find somebody who saw things that way and who felt that way. And so I always just had this beautiful relationship with video games. And when I was at my parents' house, where I felt a lot more alone in a lot of ways, in a sense, I didn't feel alone, because I was able to buy, Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time when it came out. You'd go to Toys R Us and they had these little tickets you'd get that would say the name of the game on it. And I put it in a safe space. You'd pay $5 and it would reserve the copy for you, so that you knew on the first day that it came out, you could go get it. And so I'd put it in a safe space and I'd look at it all the time, and I'd look at the ticket and I'd dream about the game, and I'd have this memory of just imagining Link. It's a sort of a fantasy environment. He's an elf, and he has the long ears, and he lives in a forest in Ocarina of Time to begin the game. But I just remember my imagination coming up with this picture of a pot, a big black cauldron on a fire, and a potion being made in the pot, and him looking into the pot. And it was just my imagination going to all the places I could think of that, magic would exist. And so I had a lot of time with my imagination in that way, where it would reconfigure the world and create these moments that I would just dive into and disappear in. And so that's why I said earlier I was going to talk about video games, but I mentioned there were two things that were sort of like one thing. And the reason for that is that, to an extent, my life was a video game to me in ways that are deeper than I have really indicated yet, in the sense that I started to have experiences that that created, I think, like a separation between me and the world, as if there were this other world layered on top of the one that everybody else was in. And I was in that pocket world where I experienced everything from such a different place that anything I said, nobody would really hear in a very real sense, because I'm sitting there describing the world that I live in. And it just so happens the same language applies to the world that everybody else lives in. But from where I was coming from, it was almost like everything was a simulation. It was almost like everything was structures and systems and beliefs and patterns. And I wasn't really interacting with people. I would just interact with their beliefs. I had these hopes with people, like with my dad, who I loved. I had these hopes that, in a very real way, the connection that I knew would it was like I wanted the nightmare that had happened to reveal itself to have never really been there, never really been real, to have been false. Like for the years of my life spent with him and my stepmom, where they're always embroiled in argument and all of these manipulative dynamics, where my stepmother would shout, "You're manipulating me," even though my dad, like, he wasn't, you know, I don't see it. Like, I don't know what she could have really been talking about, because my dad had no life outside of work, really, and playing video games at home. And they were both financially responsible people that were very pragmatic about finances, to the point that, you know, I felt like money was more important to them than I was, or my brother, you know? And that was kind of a theme in our family, was the price tag attached to things. Because my family's a little wealthier. My great-grandfather was the president of a car company called Packard Motor Car Company. And so my grandparents had a very beautiful house. It was quite large, you know, multiple floors, 3 bedrooms in the upstairs, and then downstairs there was a kitchen, a living room, a mud room, a workshop that my grandfather had. There was a dining room that we almost never ate at except on Christmas Eve and Christmas. And, or I guess just Christmas Eve, pretty much, was the only time I went in there. Maybe Thanksgiving, my grandma would use it too, but I wasn't there for that. She loved holidays, though, so. Oh, and that reminds me, I was gonna say, she was the person in my family who didn't have a conflict in her. There wasn't some festering kind of a secret aspect to her personality, where my grandfather had some anger in him. I think, I mean, he could certainly be quite callous, and he could really push people away, and he could say some things that were quite terrible about my grandmother. But my grandmother just, I never heard, like, she never had anything but a nice word to say about everyone. It was always, "Isn't so-and-so so wonderful?" You know, and she'd invite them over to swim in our pool, because my grandparents had a nice pool. And even though, you know, my grandma had a Steinway grand piano and this beautiful room to play it in, she would still drive me to someone from church who taught piano lessons to get me lessons. And it was a long drive, but she was, you know, was really supportive of the people at the church. And she wanted to do that, to be supportive. Even though I remember asking, "Well, why don't you just teach me, Grandma?" Because my grandma played the piano very beautifully, and she played every Sunday church service. So yeah, that was She had a very beautiful spirit, and that was the thing that like really grounded a lot of the energies that I talked about. So similarly to how with my uncle, he made it possible for me to drink and smoke and do stuff like that without it being an act of rebellion. It was something that was just very natural to my personality, even though others might see it as rebellious. Similarly with my grandmother, even though my parents had created this natural sort of a rebellion against authority in me and authority figures and people saying this is how things are, you know, and like laying down the law and putting things that way, my grandmother had this aspect of her personality that totally diffused all of that in me, because she just stayed oriented always toward positive kinds of interactions with people and seeing people in a positive light and not saying like, I guess, critical things, where my dad and my stepmom were extremely critical and very judgmental about the people at their work and would talk about how incompetent they were all the time. And my grandfather was extremely critical as well. And you could say that I'm a critical person. However, it doesn't come from a desire to judge people in my case. Every now and then, like, I'll go at somebody's ego because it's fun, you know? It's funny. But only if there's like no other avenue to have a real conversation with them, because I'll always default to trying to reach people through reason and logic. And reason and logic are the things that really will, judge a person's statements, their thoughts, their feelings. Those are the things that, you could say egotistically judge them. Because if you point out that someone's wrong about something that they believe in, they can feel like that's an attack on them. When all that it really is perspective that they can use to compare for themselves and say, is what is being said more logical than what I'm saying? Which is a necessary part of developing critical thinking. You need to be able to question what you're saying, because that's how you can see both sides of an argument. Generally, you have to start by questioning it, because you're not going to say something that you don't believe in. But if you also don't have the ability to see how other people might see it, then you're missing a fundamental part of the picture, of the greater picture, of how things are structured, how stuff works. But my grandmother was such a nice person. She didn't want to put people on the spot that way and just wanted to have like lovely interactions with people. And so she and I would watch old movies together, like Audrey Hepburn and Katharine Hepburn movies and Gregory Peck, and we'd watch Groucho Marx. And she loved Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie, and her favorite show was I Love Lucy. So I've seen probably every episode of that. and she was just a very lovely person. And she had a civility to her where she would say things like, no talking about politics or religion at the dinner table. And her main thing that she defaulted to when talking about people was that everything was about class. She would say, don't say that, that's low class. And it wasn't, to her, it wasn't an issue of like money. It had nothing to do with money. But there was an idea that, people with money had a responsibility to have this kind of a dignity and class where they were non-judgmental of other people, where they were understanding and polite, even if they had to reserve their own thoughts and feelings for themselves. They were understanding and polite on the surface. And so that was what set the basis for my life. And so that's where I'll start for now. And if people are interested, I'll tell more of this story later.